It's not working. That was the thought I had while I sat quietly in front of my therapist. The thought that haunted me for months before I was even able to say it out loud. And I don't mean not working like a broken printer or a frozen Zoom call. Not working like something that needs a tweak. I mean, these interventions she was suggesting was fundamentally not working. And don't get me wrong, I was a professor of positive psychology at the time. I had published over 100 papers on well-being. I lectured on flourishing. I designed interventions to build resilience, help many organizations build thriving cultures. And yet there I was, utterly depleted. Not just tired, not just exhausted, but completely hollowed out. Entirely burnt out. You know, the irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, someone who taught others how to prevent burnout, and now I was the one crawling through its dark depths. And these well-being tools I used, the tools I designed and prescribed, the tools I once trusted, they felt like nothing more than sandbags in a flood of despair. And it wasn't that I didn't try them. Man, I tried them all. I tried meditation. I tried journaling. I tried gratitude visits. I even went out in nature, which I freaking hated. But nothing worked. And you know what I realized? If the interventions weren't working for me, someone who was trained to understand them, someone who developed them, someone who wanted them to work, what hope did they have for the average employee within a broken system? And that is when it kind of like hit me. We weren't just designing weak interventions. We were fundamentally solving the wrong problems. Did you know that almost all of the interventional level interventions don't work in practice? You know, the industry is worth around 65 billion euros in 2024, and next year is estimated to be 90 billion euros, right? Yet we're sitting at burnout levels that are at epidemic levels. And there are so many studies showing that these interventions that we're using is not having any effect on our burnout, on our well-being. Let's take Andrew Fleming's study from 2024. He looked at 223 companies and followed 46,000 employees that kind of went through these well-being interventions. And do you know what he found? That there was no significant difference in well-being between those of people who went through the intervention versus those who did not. And do you know what was even worse? Sometimes the people that went through the interventions were actually worse off than when they started. So taken together, his study showed that not only did we not improve well-being, but it had no impact on real hard performance metrics, and therefore there was no real-world return on investment. One of my favorite studies of a very large-scale randomized controlled trial that was done in practice was by the University of Chicago. They implemented an 18-month intervention with 32,000 employees, experimental control group, in a real active work environment. So they implemented physiological interventions like exercise and drink and stop drinking and, eating right and etc. But they also looked at psychological things like burnout prevention training, mindfulness stuff, well-being interventions. And after 18 months, do you know what they found? That there was only a slight change in, I exercised a little bit more and I lost a little bit of weight and I maybe stopped smoking a little bit, right? But no other impact on any hard clinical metric, whether it's heart rate, fitness, or etc., but also no impact on any well-being, self-reported well-being things. They also looked at the impact of this intervention on hard performance metrics like absenteeism, tenure, and production rates, and nothing was affected. So the largest RCT, practical RCT, showed that these interventions didn't work. And you know what? I felt angry. I felt betrayed, disillusioned. more importantly, I felt confused. But fundamentally, I felt hopeless. But you know what? I also felt implicated. Because I was part of this problem. We all are. The researchers, the consultants, the vendors trying to sell you that new latest app, the HR departments trying to think they're doing something good, but they're not actually doing anything with real-world impact, the self-help books and self-help gurus trying to sell you the next hot thing. We all were implicated in this. Because we created an industry, a whole ideology around the idea that you can breathe your way out of burnout. That resilience was nothing more than the solution to a toxic work environment. That well-being was just a matter of grit, your mindset, and mood tracking. And I started speaking to a lot of people going through the same things, to employees, to CEOs, to other academics. And when I started to listen, really started to listen to these practitioners and employees, they all fundamentally said the same thing. We tried all of these things, but nothing really changed. And you know what? Are you burnt out? Then we're trying to sell you this new breathing exercise. You seem very disengaged in this conversation. Have you tried this new evidence-based strengths app? We're trying to force down interventions that was not designed for you in the first place. Because fundamentally, we turned systemic dysfunction into individual pathology. And in doing so, we kept the real problems safely out of frame and under wraps. So I wanted to understand this. I wanted to understand why these things don't work. And just like any other academic, I went into the literature and I read every meta-analysis, every longitudinal trial, any critical review I could find about why these interventions don't work. And you know what I found? The main reason why these things don't work wasn't because they were poorly designed. It wasn't because of the competence of the facilitators or of the intent of the companies, or because there was a lack of resources. But rather, the problem was that our conceptualization of well-being is fundamentally wrong. And when we build interventions around conceptualizations of things that are wrong, we will not expect a positive outcome. Because our current approach towards well-being makes a lot of inaccurate assumptions. One, we assume that well-being is a static and measurable metric, just like blood pressure, relatively stable over time, but it fluctuates. It's similar for everybody, that the drivers and the detractors are universal for you and for me, and that we can neatly capture a person's experience of well-being in a one-dimensional survey. And fundamentally, that we have this belief that if we know a person scores low on happiness and high on burnout, that we know exactly how to fix them. But ladies and gentlemen, burnout was never a number. It was never a checklist, and it's never been a universal recipe. Yet we as a society, and yet we as consultants and researchers, we treat it like that. But when we look at these these traditional top-down, very popular models, what's fundamentally wrong with them? The PERMAs, the mental health continuums, the life satisfactions. All these models are designed from a top-down perspective. In other words, I, as the professor, dictate to you, as the client, what well-being is and should be. But well-being is not a generic survey. It's not generic components. It's a deeply personal experience. So what are the problems with these top-down models? Well, one, they're culturally biased. 99% of these models are developed within Western contexts and then applied in other contexts, hoping that they would work. So it really lacks global nuance. Second, it's created static categories of what well-being is and should be. So it starts to prescribe to you that well-being is a function of emotional, psychological, and social well-being. That to get to flourishing, you need to have positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishments, right? So when we force people into static categories, we miss individual variation. Don't let me get started on how we measure these things. So even the instruments that we use are fundamentally flawed because they're ripe with social desirability, because I want to give myself forth as a little bit more positive than I actually am. The instruments provide limited insights beyond the 5 things that it's measuring, and we kind of know that these instruments have severe validity issues, that they do not produce the same amount of reliability and validity in different contexts. Then there's also the jingle-jangle fallacy, the fact that we're trying to create new concepts out of old things that already kind of like exist, that we use the same name like flourishing for psychological well-being, or we use the same word flourishing for a combination of eudaimonic and hedonic well-being. We have this tendency to take things that already exist, put them together, slap a nice jacket around it, and call it something new. And that dilutes what these constructs actually are. And then finally, we have this idea about expert-defined constructs don't necessarily meet people's lived experiences, because we as a society, we as professors, are dictating to you what well-being is and should be, but yet this fundamentally differs from what well-being is for the person actually living it. But let's also look at the difference within these two paradigms, right? So we've built well-being around the same idea that we used to build pathology around, right? That to say that we can measure, that the same principles apply to well-being that it does on psychopathology or illness. But fundamentally, these two things are two different stuff, because psychopathology, mental illness, is deficit orientated, meaning that there is some form of normality that someone has identified, and then you deviate from this. In other words, I am not normal because I'm depressed, but I know because I'm depressed, I know what strategies to use to be able to get you to normal, what the symptoms are. But well-being is not deficit orientated. There's no endpoint to the amount of meaning that you can experience, right? So it's growth orientated. There's no outcome. There's no top end experience of this. So now we're applying the same fundamental principles that we did with illness on well-being, and the two paradigms don't match. Secondly, the models that we are designing for well-being ignore context. So they assume that everybody goes through the same thing, and that these 4 constructs or 5 constructs that we're measuring is the same for everybody, and that context is something that we should control for and not something that is fundamentally impacting your well-being. In other words, inflation, the rate of increase in prices, is something that directly affects your well-being, but you don't necessarily know it because you're not conscious of it. Researchers ignore that and just say, well, it's just about how you think, feel, and function, which is not correct. Thirdly, we have this binary classification model. You're either well or you're not well. You're either flourishing or you're languishing, or you're moderately mentally healthy. But well-being cannot be fitted into nice, clean categories. But for me, the main problem is that our theories, the ideas that we have, don't necessarily match the measures that we have around them. Let's take the mental health continuum from Corey Keyes as an example. And I believe that this is one of the only models that we have that is actually quite robust. Yet it is also fundamentally flawed in the way in which was conceptualized and the way in which its measures do not match. So Corey Keyes indicated that mental health and flourishing is a function of a dynamic interaction of emotional, psychological, and social well-being. In other words, feeling good, functioning well, and fitting in. Right? Now, when we talk about this dynamic interaction, he indicates that flourishing is like a function of experiencing certain symptoms in emotional, psychological, and social well-being. Yet, it's measured as 3 different components. We call it confirmatory factor analytic models, where we say that emotional well-being is something on its own, it's related to something else, but it's something separate. So is social well-being, and so is psychological well-being. But when you spend time with your friends, right, don't you feel that time goes by super fast? Isn't that flow? Aren't you also feeling happy and pleasure while you're in that moment? Yeah, you are. So in practice, these things are entangled with each other, but we try to force them into 3 totally separate things. So our measurement model is not correct. But let's make it even more complex. He indicated that when you have these different symptoms, you can be classified onto a range, a continuum from languishing to flourishing on the well-being scale. So, statistically speaking, a continuum is a range between two endpoints, between -5 and +5, between 0 and 100, right? But when we model it, we place people into three categories: a category for languishing, a category for moderately mentally healthy, and a category for flourishing, right? In other words, we've got three boxes, and these three boxes are the same size, and they're equally spaced between each other, so they're equally far from each other. But where does languishing stop and moderately mentally healthy actually start? And isn't there a medium-low languishing, or isn't there like a moderate flourishing, right? We can't estimate this because we have these three different boxes. And that's insane, that our theories are not measurable. The idea that we can say that a generic survey can measure a person's well-being in Nigeria, Lagos, as if it is the same for a coder in Rome. No wonder our interventions don't work. Because we are fundamentally trying to force individuals into a model of well-being and forgot about the person in the process. So if we are serious about change, and I mean real, sustained human change, we have to stop designing interventions around these prescriptive theories of well-being that have excellent marketing and that are designed for the individual's lived experience, and start designing it from the individual's lived experience. In other words, we should stop designing interventions around what the professor dictates to you what well-being should be, but instead designing it around what the person living it says it is. So until then, no amount of coaching, meditation, psychological tinkering will work, because the interventions might be precise, but the target entirely wrong. And once you realize that, you can't unsee it. So, what can we do about this? Well, I think that the future of well-being isn't a tool, it isn't a model, it's a radical transformation in the way in which we think about and approach it. We should stop trying to fix individuals and start trying to fix the systems. Now, no amount of well-being, no burnout will stop if a person is constantly stuck in this broken system. Now, the purpose of this presentation is not to go into too much detail around this, because I do believe that changing the system and the structure is the most effective way in which to facilitate well-being. So, for example, if you are high work pressure at work, hire more people, right? If the function is on output but not on people, right, and this is causing a lot of frustration and anxiety and things, then change the way in which we measure performance. But unfortunately, this is very expensive and very time consuming. So I would like to suggest that you go read Michael Steger's new paper on regenerative AI, regenerative psychology, where he talks about how you change the structure and the system to facilitate well-being. So that's the first and most important approach. But yet it's very expensive, time consuming, and causes a lot of chaos within the system itself. So the other approach, if we can't focus changing on the system because it's so difficult, then we have to start changing the way in which we think about well-being from the individual's perspective. And this is kind of where I say we have to recenter the person in well-being science, where we utilize what we call ideographic approaches towards well-being, where we move away from these top-down prescriptive models of well-being that tries to force people into a framework that wasn't designed for them, but rather utilize an approach where we place the person as the center of his or her own universe, where we create hyper-personalized well-being models where N equals 1 type of approach, where each person's well-being is seen as something unique, a case study upon themselves, right? And each person's well-being is a function of its own unique drivers and detractors, where we look at well-being from a holistic perspective, where we look at both I rate myself, subjective experiences, but also looking at objective indicators outside of me, contextual factors, gross domestic product, inflation rates, job opportunities, life expectancy at birth, access to medical care, access to childcare, political freedom, objective indicators outside of the individual, trying to match this with the subjective experiences of well-being that we rate ourselves on. But also incorporate what we call narratives, like narrative focus, where we ask people to tell stories about their well-being so that we can identify the main factors that's important for them, so that we can capitalize on that and incorporate that into our models. In other words, creating hyper-personalized, person-centered models of well-being, where we look at the person within context, right? Getting their input, using their words, right? Matching with these objective indicators, combining it into a model, giving it back to the person to try and refine and put it into his own words, coming back and only then creating tailored action interventions. In other words, we should start focusing on the person and not trying to start off with trying to prove a principle. Where we start the question about where we get our data is not how well do you score on PERMA or the mental health continuum, but rather what does well-being mean to you? Where we start looking for patterns in a person's well-being network instead of trying to force people into an idea of what well-being is or shouldn't be, trying to confirm a model. And only then do we start to make do we look for principles across people instead of making prescriptions of what well-being is and shouldn't be. So what does this science of well-being look like? What are the elements of this? Well, Brian, Dick, and I came up with 8/9 different elements of this ideographic person-centered approach towards well-being. The first is what we call ideographic primacy. In other words, we look at each individual person as a unique system, a case study onto themselves, where we start with a person and not with a theory. We don't average people into categories, we don't jam them into models, we build well-being models from their understanding and lived experiences of well-being. In other words, we are using their unique data, their language, their definition, and their life as the unit of analysis. 2 and 3 goes together. 2 talks about contextually embedded. We kind of know that context is endogenous, and not noise. It's not something we should control for. It's not something, well-being is not something that floats with about or around or within a person, but rather it's something that lives within the environments in which the individual functions. Like neighborhood safety, cultural obligations, climate stress, income instability. These aren't factors that we need to control for. There are causal factors that live within each person's unique well-being network. And when we stop treating the context as noise and start seeing it as signals, we can then truly understand what well-being is for a person. The third component is about systemic integration. We have to understand that individuals are nested within systems. I am nested within my family is nested within my neighborhood is nested within this province within this culture within this country within within Europe, etc. So each factor, each system that I'm functioning in affects my well-being in some way or form. And it really took me a while to see this, because well-being well-being doesn't live within the individual, it lives within these systems. So we can't separate a person's stress from their childcare or their anxiety about their housing crisis from their well-being, because well-being is fundamentally shaped by governmental policies, by organizational practices, about our histories, about power dynamics. So when we build models that ignore these different layers within the system, we're not simplifying our understanding of well-being. We're ignoring the importance of how these systems interact and how they affect each other. The fourth component is about well-being is not a snapshot, it's a process, a deeply personal process. In other words, well-being is not a trait that's stable over time, it's a trajectory. So we can track how a person thinks, feels, and functions over time, right? So we can start seeing how people change, when they change, and why they change, because that's where the real insights live. Similarly, when we try to assess a person's well-being, we know that we can't just use one indicator of well-being. We can't just use one data source to help us, because if you ask me to complete a questionnaire, I might not necessarily know what my well-being actually is, right? So we can't just use one data source. We have to use multiple data sources so that we can really get a bigger and a better understanding of who you are. So in other words, we have to combine things like your personal narratives with psychometrics and objective indicators. We can use things like diaries and wearables. We can use mood tracking and environmental sensors. We can use self-report measures, macroeconomic factors. So the more data that we have, the better our understanding of who you are and how you function. It is a lot messier, but it is also more honest, it's also more complete and more person-centered. Sixth, plasticity and feedback. We kind of know that people adapt, so does their well-being models, because people aren't static and neither is their suffering or their well-being, because we adjust, we look at things differently, and we learn, and therefore we change. Because sometimes the way in which something affects me is affected by a simple conversation that I have or a promotion that I have. One conversation with my mentor can fundamentally change how I perceive a very stressful event. And because of that, instead of becoming a detractor of well-being, it could potentially become a driver of it. And that is kind of what plasticity is, where we kind of like learn from interaction with the environment, but only if we're paying attention can we actually change things. Number 7, this is an important one. We call this functional non-equivalence. The idea is that the same condition that can promote well-being for one person can impair it for another. So for example, loneliness might be a big driver for depression and mental health problems for one person, but for another it might actually be a facilitator to creativity and connection, right? For example, stress can drain you. There's that inverse U-curve on stress. Stress is important to help with performance, but up until a point where it becomes dysfunctional. But it really depends where that change is for each individual person. So instead of asking whether something is good or bad, we start asking, what is the role that this thing in your life plays for you at this specific moment in time? And then finally, we have something called participatory validity. In other words, the well-being models that we create is co-created between a practitioner and an individual. That means that participants aren't just subjects we need to understand, but rather co-creators of their well-being. Because they define and review their own models. We help them to structure it, but they put it into their own words. They adjust the labels, they question the links, and they say, that's not what I meant. And then we listen. A good example of this is in one of our one of our studies. It came out that a person flagged as waking up 3 a.m. every morning. And our model indicated, oh, this is insomnia. Insomnia is a detractor of well-being. So we interviewed the person and asked, why do you wake up every morning at 3 a.m.? And she's like, well, I'm an American citizen living in Poland and my Bible study group is in the US. So I wake up every morning at 3 a.m. because that's when my Bible study group meets. So fundamentally, something that was classified as a detractor of well-being, insomnia, was actually a driver of well-being, social support and connection. So it's important to understand the things from the people's perspective and not just from a top-down perspective. And only once we have all of this stuff in place can we intervene and can we act. And only then can we start looking for patterns and looking for the way in which things are consistent for people over time. Because we kind of like talk about meeting people where they're at, but that only kind of like works if we actually listen to them. And here's the thing. When we actually listen to them, when we stop prescribing and start partnering with people, we'll actually start to see them to respond to our treatments and our interventions a lot better. Because then they open up, because then they will actually engage, and then they will actually trust and change. Because then, for the first time in their lives, we're not trying to fix them, we're trying to see them. Because, ladies and gentlemen, here is what I think the future of well-being looks like. It's not about interventions that work, but it's about models that respect complexity and models that respect the lived experiences of the people within those systems. Because programs that we create that are co-authored with the people we're trying to help, and not just me designing it and applying it onto you. Because fundamentally, the real expert on your well-being isn't your psychologist, it isn't your manager, and it certainly is not an algorithm. It's you. So what do we need to build these hyper-personalized models? Well, as I mentioned, I went through this massive burnout and I tried to figure out how to fix this within myself. And I thought to myself, well, I wanted to create this holistic model of well-being where we look at the objective indicators and subjective stuff and personal narratives and try to throw this all together and create something grand. But I sat with 4 big problems that I needed to solve. The one was, what does holistic well-being look like? I needed a way to figure out how do objective, subjective, and personal experiences link together. The second problem I experienced was, how do I analyze people's personal accounts of their well-being? How do I scale it so that I can identify the drivers and detractors of their well-being? I mean, in therapy, it's easy because I sit there and I listen to you and I take my mental model of well-being and I take your story and I populate it in there. And then I come up with this model. But how do we scale this to 20, 30, 100, 200, 600, a billion people? Right? We had needed to figure out how to do this. Then, even if we know what a holistic model of well-being is and what their personal stories is and how to analyze them, how do we develop a roadmap, a personal roadmap for well-being for each individual person? Right? How do we get from here to Berlin? What's the fastest route that we can take? What's the best transportation method, right? How do we figure that out? And then finally, how do I combine all of this stuff together to help you with your well-being? So let's look at these 4 problems and how I solved them. So the first problem was we wanted to get this holistic model of well-being, where we looked at objective indicators, subjective indicators, and then mental health problems, things that drive and detract from well-being. So we've kind of like found that we have like 210, I think, objective indicators, things outside of the individual that affect their well-being. So for example, job opportunities. If you're a psychologist living in Berlin, we kind of like know that what is the job opportunities for this person. We scan Indeed, LinkedIn, looking for the amount of vacancies that's available, right? We look at health status. If we know you were born in Berlin, we can estimate your life expectancy at birth based on your age. We can look at how much access to medical care you have, how many doctors are there per 100,000 people. Same with mental health stuff, right? We look at our environmental factors. We look at the amount of the country that is covered by nature, how close you are to nature. We look at air pollution, water quality, sanitation, socioeconomic indicators. We look at like your spending capacity, right? Political factors. We look at things like political freedom, press freedom, right? Safety and security. We look at the amount of murders and the amount of crime in your area, right? So from this, we got about 54 of these big indicators. Subjective indicators are things that you rate about yourself, and we classified them into cognitive well-being, thinking, emotional, psychological, social, environmental, physiological, financial, and spiritual well-being. And each within all of them had different indicators. So emotional well-being, for example, feeling good is a function of affect balance and life satisfaction. Psychological well-being is functioning well, having the ability to cope with things, with the life demands, but also having meaning in my life, the ability to establish relationships, etc., and so on and so forth. And then finally, we also had mental health problems, the 4 big drivers: stress, depression, anxiety, and burnout. Okay, and each one with their own unique indicators. And then we introduced the personal narratives, where from your story specifically, we can identify the personal drivers, detractors, and elements of well-being. So that was kind of like the holistic well-being model and assessment that we had. The next part was then how to dissect personal narratives. Now, the traditional approach would be think thematic content analysis. I get data, I ask you about your story. I try to extract themes from your story. Right? From those themes, I start to create categories. So I slot them in if they're a demand, a resource, or a well-being factor. And then I build your personal model of well-being. So that is a traditional approach that we would kind of like do in qualitative analysis, right? But the problem is this is not scalable because we can do this for 10, 20 people, but we cannot do this for 1 million people. So it's impossible to do this type of, inverted commas, thematic content analysis without the utilization of AI. So we utilized various types of analysis to kind of help identify and mine these different themes, and I'll go into them a little bit more detail in a moment. But we started off with topic modeling, right? Trying to identify these unique themes in each person's personal narrative. Then we have a list of all of the stuff that's important for you, but then we needed to figure out a way to add a value to it so that we can actually model these things quantitatively. So we then did sentiment analysis on each one of these themes to see if they're positive, negative, or neutral, because then we can start building them into our quantitative models. We used supervised learning to try and classify these themes into demands, resources, strengths, and well-being factors, right? And then we used strength and direction assessments to kind of figure out, are they actually contributors or detractors of a person's well-being? And then we utilized like dimension reduction techniques like principal component analysis, k-means clustering, DB scans, and so on to try and see how these unique factors cluster together for each individual. So how does this look like kind of like in practice? So we started off with around 200,000 instances of well-being, people's reports of well-being, right? And we coded them like we would do in a normal thematic content analytic way. So we had one rater, myself, and another rater kind of rating each one of these 20,000 themes, right? And kind of seeing what the overlap was. From this, we kind of figured out there's about 361 different themes, or different drivers, detractors, or elements of well-being. We then trained two models. The one was Roberta to try and do the classification of the themes, and Llama to try and help us to extract the themes. So we fine-tuned both of these models to help us get the themes basically from the data. Llama was used for the individual level themes, and Roberta was used to cluster these things into life demands, resources, and etc., which we'll talk about in a moment. Then we evaluated this on 600,000 instances of well-being. So we looked at all of the open data sources that we could find on OSF, on Kaggle, on Hugging Face, anything related to mental health. And we also started scraping Reddit, social media, Twitter, so that we can get a lot of things where people talked about their mental health or well-being, so that we can evaluate our model on it. Do you know what we found? Nearly 50% of the things that we came out of our data, the themes, was unaccounted for by any of the current models of well-being. So for example, pet ownership was a big theme that came out as an actual component of well-being. There is no model currently on Earth that I know of these top-down models that models pet ownership as a driver of well-being, as a part of well-being. Right? So that was an important finding. And we also found that around 200, we could basically accurately predict around 200 of the 371 factors with a 95% level of accuracy. So that was kind of cool. So now we have the themes. But we can't do a lot with the themes on its own, because we have to categorize them. And as I mentioned, we did sentiment analysis to kind of look at the emotional tone in each of these sentences so that we can add a value to it. If it was negative, -5. If it was positive, +5. It was neutral, 0. The reason for this was because we needed to add this value so we can start modeling these things quantitatively later. Then we used dimension reduction techniques like PCA, principal component analysis, k-means clustering, and so on, to try and cluster these factors around 6 broad categories. The one was life demands, things outside of you that affect your well-being. So for example, work pressure, access to medical care, so on. Life resources are things outside of you that actually contributes to your well-being, right? So mentor support, peer support, and so on. We have personal resources. These are things inside of you that make you unique, that's unique to you. So for example, creativity, grit, resilience, your strengths. Personal demands are the negative stuff inside of you that affect your well-being. And that's, for example, emotional labor, anxiety, right? So we started clustering it around these 5 broad factors. And then finally, also well-being factors, things that are important for your well-being, that's important around your definition of well-being. What did we find? We found that there are unique patterns and associations between these different factors, right? So what was a driver for one person was a detractor for another. Think about that loneliness example. And we found that these drivers are not uniform. They're not the same for everybody. Okay, so now we got the categories. Now we needed to throw all of this stuff together so we can build some theoretical/empirical model around well-being. We used feature engineering so we can actually make the words quantifiable, so we can actually start modeling them. we used supervised learning techniques in order to help us to classify the strength and direction of the supervised learning to actually classify the factors. And then finally, we used shape and line factoring to help us to figure out which factor influences each other the most, so we can find the strongest path, the strongest predictor of your well-being, so we know where to intervene. So our theoretical model kind of looked like this, right? We have your well-being model. This is my model, for example, with the main factors that affect it there. And then we have life demands that affect your well-being negatively, life resource that affect it positively, and then we've got moderators, things that influence it. So personal demands are like emotional labor that moderates the relationship between life demands and well-being. In other words, if you've got high work pressure, but I'm also experiencing a lot of emotional labor, it means that the experience of work pressure would have a stronger effect on my well-being than if emotional labor was not there. And the same on the positive end with life resources. So if autonomy is a strong predictor of well-being, I can do what I want, when I want, how I want. Then if I can also use my strengths a lot more in my work, the effect of that autonomy would be a lot stronger on my well-being. And here are just some examples of the factors that we kind of like found in each of the categories. So for life demands, we've got aging, financial distress, task complexity, role conflict. For life resources, diversity and inclusion, safe transportation, social support, job satisfaction, participatory decision making, etc. Personal demands inside of you, anxiety, burnout, techno stress, interpersonal issues, proactivity, procrastination. Personal resources, strengths, creativity, forgiveness, gratitude, perseverance. Things that's unique for person's well-being is like eco-consciousness, hope and optimism, self-compassion, mindfulness, meaningfulness, life satisfaction, so on, self-transcendence. So these are all the factors that we kind of like had for well-being and the different components of it and drivers and distractors of it. The third part was now we've got the model, we've got a way to kind of like, we've got the quantitative model, we can model the qualitative stuff in, but now how do we combine all of this stuff together so we can help you find your unique person-specific roadmap or path to well-being? So we found three important things here, that we all focus on different aspects of our lives, right? And different aspects in our lives dictate how a certain function will actually manifest. So for example, work pressure might be a big thing at work, but you might not have work pressure at home. So if you measure something in your personal life versus in your overall life versus in your work life, you will get different factors. So there's different components of your life that we have to take in consideration here. Like I mentioned way before, we have to understand this model and the person within the context in which they're living. So we have to understand these external factors, environmental factors that affect their well-being, like how GDP and inflation and social safety and these things affect it. And then finally, we also have to know where the problem starts for a person, and we also have to figure out what's the best way to kind of fix them. So if you think about a roadmap, there's 1,000 different routes that we can get from Amsterdam to Berlin, right? We have to figure out what is the fastest route to get there and what's the strongest car we can use, or the strongest vehicle, or the best vehicle to be able to get there for each person. So just as a reminder, our theoretical framework was this, and we kind of link these things then also to objective work indicators and personal indicators. So for example, your well-being model is amazing, but it also needs to affect something within the company. Otherwise, a company is not going to pay for you to go through some well-being experience. So we looked at how this well-being affects performance. We looked at how it affects organizational performance and how, for example, it affects customer experiences. So in a quantitative sense, this is kind of what a model would look like. So I would come in and basically indicate, in the financial industry, we kind of see that workload, financial obligations, family responsibilities are important factors. Social support, growth opportunities, and autonomy are important drivers of well-being. And these are the potential moderators, strengths, and emotional labor, and these are the outcomes. So I would go in, ask you these questions with a survey, and then model it, and then find what the strongest route is. Because in this case, for example, it would be financial obligations was the strongest predictor, and the tractor of well-being and autonomy was the strongest predictor. So in other words, if I wanted to improve well-being to improve performance, I would spend 100 euros out of my 500 euros on or 250 euros on improving financial obligations, and another 250 euros on improving autonomy, because those are the two strongest predictors towards well-being in this case. So that's how we would do this quantitatively. But it becomes difficult because that is a very global orientated thing, and it's very generic because we use mean scores and factor scores to figure out what's important for the majority of the people. But by combining all of this stuff, right, we can come up with person-specific routes towards well-being. So I do measure all of the stuff that I've measured, that I asked before, but with my personal story, we kind of realize, oh, work pressure, which is something I didn't measure quantitatively, but came out of the qualitative data. Work pressure was an important driver. So was career transition and chronic pain, detractors, negatively affecting well-being, and mentor support, that should be peer support and personal growth, right? These are main predictors of well-being. So if these two in my model, for example, were the strongest, so work pressure was the thing that distracted it the most, and mentorship support was the thing that improved it the most. In terms of my personal moderators, we had anhedonia. So think about losing pleasure in previously pleasurable activities. That was the main moderator. And social isolation, loneliness, was actually a driver of my well-being. And I'll explain this in the next slide. But if we can create these personal roadmaps to well-being, we know out of all of these different roads we can take, right? These are the two roads that would be the fastest to get me to well-being. And then build interventions around those. So now we have everything. We have a big model for well-being. We have a way to kind of assess personal narratives. We have a way to kind of combine all of to create personal roadmaps for well-being, and now we have to combine everything together so that we can help the individual sitting in front of us figure out what the well-being is and what's the best way to approach it. So let's run through a case study to make this very practical. So last year we ran a small study around 670 people from around 120 countries on all of the indicators that we had. We initially had on the subjective, so self-report things, we had around 127 indicators. After the validation of our model, we found that 57 was the most important. And objective indicators, we started with 210 indicators and finally came down to 54, which is the strongest predictors of well-being. And we validated the model by utilizing bifactor ESEM with two general factors. A general factor for well-being, which is a function of all of the subjective and objective criteria, and another general factor for mental health problems, which is a function of burnout, stress, anxiety, and depression. And we validated this against task performance. So let's look at the quantitative on the group level, what the results were. So I just drew the model like this because otherwise it would look a little bit too complicated. But we have the two general factors for one for well-being and one for common mental health problems. And we found that well-being was strongly predictive towards task performance with a beta of 44, and common mental health problems negatively affected well-being with 0.3. And both of them together explained around 42% of the variance in task performance, normal. Then we applied machine learning structure equation modeling and so on. And we kind of like found for each of the factors, affect balance, life satisfaction, psychological well-being, social well-being, etc., how each factor individually affected a person's performance. So in this case, we actually found that affect balance and life satisfaction were actually detractors of performance and not facilitators, right? And then here we just do it for all of the individual factors. This is just for the group factors. And these are the objective indicators. Here we can kind of like see that almost all of the factors are actually detractors of performance. So health status, socioeconomic factors, environmental variables, and security things actually detract from it. So on average, if you have to start a 100-meter race, and this is kind of like you're starting actually 150 meters and not at 100 meters while you're comparing to other people. Right, so this looks very different for every country. So in Amsterdam, if you take the individual level, for example, almost everything is high as an example, but this is our average. Okay, so this is kind of like how each factor individually contributed to well-being, so to performance. So as you can see, objective indicators of well-being actually detracted from it. So does mental health problems, but the subjective indicators of well-being actually facilitated it. We also assessed entropy. So entropy talks about the amount of chaos within a system, and it's usually modeled on a scale of 0 to 1. Where in this case, for example, with gender, males, females, non-binary, and other, we kind of like see that if it's like close to 1, it means that there is so much variation within the system that each individual person needs their own unique intervention. If it was very close to 1, or very close to 0, right, then it means that there's generic needs in this system, so we can do general training, for example. But here we, for example, see that the unique needs for the males, females, non-binary, and other, they all have unique things that's important for them, so a one-size-fits-all intervention for well-being wouldn't work. And we did the same thing for the countries, just to give you an indication. We also looked at the effect of mental health problems and well-being on performance, and we kind of like modeled it to see like where do different countries lie. So for example, countries that are low or high on mental health and high on well-being, that is for example Portugal, where people that are low on mental health problems and low on well-being at the same time, Switzerland as an example. We also did latent profile analysis, where we kind of like looked at how what types of people, what types of groups are within this system, and we kind of found 9 groups, 9 profiles of different types of people, and we modeled them like on the scale of like mental health problems and well-being. So we kind of found that people that are high on mental health problems and low on mental health, high on well-being and low on mental health problems, these are the flourishing group. If they were high on mental health problems and low on well-being, they were people in crisis. So this way we can kind of get a nice visual overview of where our people lies, because each category here, each type of person requires a different type of intervention in order to do so. Okay. We also ran simulations around it, so on that previous group, to kind of see if we improve well-being by 10 points for one of these categories, which category would show the most likelihood to change into a different category. So if we improve the significant concern groups with 10% or 10 points, how likely are they to move into that category or into this category? So our results showed that for the people that were high on mental health problems and high on well-being, they were more likely to move into a different category if we implemented an intervention, right? And the same for the people that were high on mental health, high on flourishing and low on mental health problems. So these are the 2 groups that I would intervene, where I would spend most of my money to get the most bang of my buck for my buck. So if I improve 10% here, they're more likely to change it to a better category. And if I do it again into a better category, and if I do it then again into a more better category. Where for the people that are, I don't know, in the green, which is the medium group, they would tend to one very less likely to change. They will pretty much stay there. So I would not spend most of my time on them. Okay, I'm not going to do this. And then finally, we used like Bayesian network analysis to kind of figure out the unique routes towards well-being for this on the group level, right? So we say unified well-being affects performance. Well, we can see that doing pro-social behavior affects spiritual well-being, and spiritual well-being improves overall well-being, which then improves my performance. Same thing with mental health problems. We can look at the origin of it. So we're going to see what distracts from performance. We say, oh, okay, it starts with burnout. Burnout leads to anxiety. Actually, sorry. This is satisfaction of living conditions. If I'm not happy with where I live, it's the main cause of burnout. Burnout causes anxiety, which causes depression, which causes stress, which causes mental health problems, which negatively affects my my performance. So this is with cross-sectional data, we can kind of figure out exactly where the starting point is of this, so we know where to intervene. We will most likely to get the effect. So now we got the quantitative stuff in part. Let's talk about the qualitative information, the more interesting things. And let's use me as a case study with my data. So just a refresher, remember, life resources is a positive predictor, life demands negative, and these are our moderators, right? So this is my model of well-being. My life demands are chronic pain, went through a major career transition, and experienced a lot of work pressure. My life resources, the things external to me that facilitate my well-being, is peer support, mental support, and personal growth. Personal resources is authenticity and creativity and social isolation. Now, social isolation, like I mentioned before, is actually a detractor for people's well-being. But for me, it's a driver. Why? Because I'm a massive introvert. And I like to be alone. And when I stay alone, and it gets to that point where the loneliness and the social isolation becomes, I get this yearning to engage with people, then I start to engage with my mentors and my peers, and I think about great projects to do. So we get everybody together, so all the people that's important for me, so we get them together, we do a project together, and I feel good because I can live my creativity out. I get to spend time with the people that's important for me, and I do something meaningful, right? On my demands, anhedonia, like I said, the inability to experience pleasure in previously pleasurable activities, is a negative aspect for my well-being, and vulnerability, because I don't like showing vulnerability to people. But then also, connection to nature is a major detractor. Now, all of the meaning research shows that connection to nature is one of the strongest predictors of having meaning in life, which is a big factor for well-being, right? But for me, it's a major detractor. Why? Because I fucking hate nature, right? I hate being outside because I hate being dirty. And being outside means being dirty. My friends used to say my house is so clean that it felt to them like a hotel room, like a hotel, because I don't like being dirty. I've got this pathology around stuff being dirty. So going outside in nature causes my shoes, my clothes, my things to be dirty, which causes me a lot of anxiety, right? So actually not being in nature is actually good for my well-being. And then the unique factors of my well-being is cultural belongingness, because I am an immigrant in a different country. Curiosity, cognitive well-being, because I'm very curious by nature. Meaning is important for me, and of course, pet ownership. So this is my unique factors from my profile. Now, when we model this stuff together, this is how it relates to me. So, like I mentioned before, my strongest positive moderator is social isolation, and the strongest negative moderator is anhedonia, right? This is going to be important for in a couple of slides. But in order to improve my well-being, we have to manage my work pressure, and we have to get me more mentor support. Because even though all of these things are drivers of well-being, right? Mentorship support and work pressure were the two biggest factors contributing mentor support and detracting work pressure from my well-being. So in order to improve that, I will address these two aspects first. Okay. Now we also looked at, from the qualitative information, we just looked at the relationships between the different factors, and this is kind of what it looked like. What was also interesting is that we also measured burnout with a burnout assessment tool. And we kind of looked at people's narratives, and we could identify what we call high-risk words. So if a person says, oh, I'm super exhausted, like I have no energy, I don't want to go back to work. These high-risk words, if they were using these words in their stories, we looked at their level of burnout, and we could cross-validate. And we found that these high-risk words contributed around 45% of the variance in burnout. So that was the first factor, because we could kind of identify burnout by people's stories, right? We looked at negative sentiment. If there was a lot more negative than positive sentiment, in other words, emotional expression in their stories, this contributed around, I think, 20% of the weight, 30% of the weight in burnout. Lack of coping skills. This is where we kind of like modeled the amount of positive stuff you say about yourself, personal resources, and negative stuff about yourself, the demands. And if there was more demands than there were resources, in other words, lack of coping, this also negatively affected your ability to cope with stresses in the environment, which is a stronger predictor of burnout. So we found that this contributes about 20%. So 45%, 30%, 20%, and there's always some error kind of like in there. So we put in 5% error there. So my results kind of like showed that the threshold within the total sample was around 75.6, and my score is about 52. So I am under the threshold for high risk, and I'm relatively okay, but I should still be cognizant. Okay, so that's some interesting thing about the burnout assessment. Now let's get back to my personal network of well-being, right? So quantitatively, this is kind of like what it looks like. And if we wanted to improve my performance, this is kind of like the strongest route. So effect balance leading to satisfaction with living conditions, that improves my overall well-being, which improves my performance, right? Because it makes sense. Because I went through this major career transition, major burnout, right? So no balance between positive and negative stuff. And what happens when a person is depressed? What happens when there's no balance? Like their house falls apart, right? You don't clean, you don't look after yourself, your living conditions is falling apart, which then negatively affects your well-being, which negatively affects your performance, right? So in my case, it makes total sense that this is the strongest route. The same thing on the negative side, right? So cognitive well-being, like because I'm so cognitively overloaded, this is the thing that caused burnout. The burnout caused anxiety, anxiety caused stress, stress caused mental health problems, which negatively affected my well-being, my performance. Right. So you see how we can now create personalized roadmaps for well-being like this. So in other words, for me to manage my burnout, for me, we had to look at managing the cognitive well-being aspect so that we can improve my performance or reduce the effect that this thing has on my performance. Okay, so what does this all kind of like mean? So pause for a moment and take a screenshot of this and come up with a way and comment down below. How would you help me as a therapist, right? Knowing everything you know about me, what would you suggest for me to do in order to improve my well-being where I am at now? Pro tip, look at this factor, that factor, and these two drivers. Okay, so what is the implications of this model? Well, the first thing is we can start to create, if we can do hyper-personalized assessments, we can do hyper-personalized interventions, because now we can figure out exactly what's important for you and target the right stuff which will have the most impact, right? We will also make better diagnostics that provide us with better insights about the people, which means that we can make better diagnostics in inverted commas about well-being and pathology. We can also scale the assessments, right? These types of hyper-personalized assessments, not just to 10, 20, or 30 people, to 1 billion people if we have the capacity. And then finally, it allows us to empower individuals to make better decisions about their own well-being and their own lives. Because this entire model can help us organizations to create better organizational policies, right? It can help us to approach well-being in a totally different way, an approach that can really help create real-world impact for the individual and the system in which they function in. Some ethical things we have to consider is that garbage in, garbage out, right? Systems are only as objective as the people that create them. So when we look at, for example, biosystems, there's this very nice case study on what happened with Amazon and their ATS system. So they wanted to create a AI model that can help them identify the top candidates from CVs before they actually selected them for interviews, right? And they kind of like found, they created this model and they submitted all of the CVs and stuff through, but they found that they kept hiring the same types of people, white people, between a certain age group from Stanford University and Harvard and blah, blah, blah. Then they realized, oh, our model is actually very biased. So let's fix this by getting a group of people, diverse people in the company, females, Indians, black people, different age groups, socioeconomic classes, whatever. Got all of these people around the table to create a new model to help us get better candidates. Do you know what they found? That even afterwards, right, they still found the same implicit biases. Why? Because these people sitting around the table all matched some of the criteria that was used. So the people were still getting people from Harvard, certain demographic groups, and etc. in. Because that's unfortunately how biased these models are. And this is something we have to take in consideration. Complacency, we tend to feel that when there's a new tool and stuff, we start to create the tool becomes the indicator, and the tool is not used as the tool anymore. So for example, when we kind of saw with psychometrics back in the day, that psychometric assessments was only used as one indicator to help make better decisions about whether a candidate is good or not for a job, right? And we would only select some of the components there. So maybe we would use the extroversion scale from the 16PF and the neuroticism scale and the person environment fit and the competency thing from another assessment, put this together and then assess a person. But now we're using the assessment, the Hogan, the whatever, the 16PF, as the assessment for person environment fit. So the tool became the indicator and not being used as a tool anymore. We also have algorithm aversion. So friends of mine did this study where they looked at how likely are people to forgive a person versus to forgive an algorithm. And they found that if they make a mistake, people are more likely to forgive a person than they are an algorithm. An algorithm makes a mistake once and you tend to distrust it. A person you're more likely to forgive. But also, in terms of algorithm aversion, the idea is to say that if something is implemented and it's perceived to be unfair by people, people are going to implement actions to regulate what they perceive to be unfair behaviors. In other words, what happened with Uber a couple of years ago? Uber started to implement dynamic pricing models. Dynamic pricing meaning that the price that you pay as a client for the driver fluctuates because of demand and supply of the available drivers. The idea behind it was to say, oh, well, we will help give drivers more money when there is a lot of people and a lot less cars. But if there's a lot of cars and a lot less people, we're not going to pay you so much, right? Because Uber thought that was fair. But the drivers found that this is not fair, right? Because they get a lot less out now than what they did before. So what they did, they created these Facebook groups and they arranged that at certain times during the day, all of the drivers would go off for half an hour, which means that the amount of people looking for drivers would increase and the supply would decrease, which means the money that they would charge would increase. So this way, the drivers regulated what they thought to be an unfair algorithm so that they could get paid fairly for what they do, with the expense of the people actually paying for their rides, right? So important to remember algorithm aversion. And then finally, system integration. The better connections we have between different systems, the better the quality of the data that we have, the better predictions we can make. So the better the AI system is that we can use. So data and value therefore go very strongly hand in hand here. However, we have to take into consideration things like data privacy, right? If I did not give you permission to scan my emails and I'm utilizing that information to make a prediction about my well-being, what does that say? So it's important to always ensure that one, the more data that we have, the better for us to make better predictions, but we also have to balance that with data privacy laws. So in conclusion, right, taking all of this stuff together, where does this leave me as the person, right? For me, it didn't really end with a breakthrough or recovery, right? This entire thing about well-being ended with a question. Like, it ended with a slower life at a different pace. Maybe a little bit more softness, a little bit more silence. And I started stop pretending that I know what well-being is and that I could fix myself with the tools that wasn't designed for me. Because I'm not doing this presentation here to sell you a new framework or not telling you what the next big model is in well-being. I only kind of came here to tell you a story, one that started with me going through a major collapse and burnout, that kind of like moved through this phase of disillusionment and where I landed in something a little bit softer, a little bit truer, and a little bit more useful. Because I'm here to kind of like say that maybe we can build something better together. Not by being certain, but by being a little bit more honest, by being a little bit more curious and a little bit more human. And that maybe is the most radical move I think we can make in this well-being science, is to stop pretending that we have the answers. And because I believe that our job is to stay curious and to help build systems that are honest and more effective. Create models that are open and fair, and create interventions that ask more than they assume. Maybe that's the most radical move we can make in this field, is to really admit that we don't really know. To let go of these archaic blueprints and checklists that we have in our minds, and to begin again, not from a theory, but from the person sitting in front of us. Because well-being was never a template, it was never a program, and it was never a metric. It's a question, and we need to start listening. So perhaps the most honest thing I can say after all of this process and of all of this modeling, is that I don't know what well-being is, and I definitely don't know what it looks like for you. But I want to ask, I want to listen, and I want to know. Because it's not working. But maybe now we finally know where to begin. By perhaps asking the most radical question of them all. What does well-being mean to you? And then we shut up and listen. Thank you very much.